As Jack navigated his semi-truck down the dark and deserted highway, he could not shake the feeling that something was off. He had been driving for hours, and the GPS had been guiding him flawlessly until he made the wrong turn. Now, his truck's headlights cast eerie shadows on the trees as he drove deeper into the unknown. The road was narrow and winding, with no signs of civilization in sight. Jack's truck rumbled and groaned as he navigated the tight turns, his heart racing with every passing mile. He checked his GPS again, but the screen was blank with no signal to be found. Suddenly, the trees parted, and Jack found himself entering a town that seemed frozen in time. The buildings were old and decrepit, with broken windows and crumbling facades. The streets were empty and silent, with no signs of life anywhere. Jack's truck rumbled to a stop in the center of town, and he killed the engine. The silence was oppressive, and Jack felt a shiver run down his spine as he climbed out of the truck. As he looked around, he noticed that his truck was no longer visible on the GPS. It was as if he had driven into a black hole, and his truck had disappeared from the face of the earth. Jack's heart was racing as he walked through the deserted streets. He called out, but his voice was swallowed up by the silence. He felt like he was walking through a ghost town, and the thought sent a shiver down his spine. As he explored the town, Jack noticed that everything was perfectly preserved. The buildings, the streets, even the old cars parked by the side of the road, everything was frozen in time, as if the town had been abandoned overnight. Jack's curiosity was getting the better of him. He wanted to know what had happened to this town, and why it seemed to be stuck in time. He decided to explore further to see if he could find any clues. As he walked, the silence seemed to grow thicker, like a fog that was closing in around him. Jack's heart was racing, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Suddenly, he heard a faint noise, like the creaking of a door. Jack's head snapped around, and he saw a figure standing in the doorway of an old building. The figure was shrouded in shadows, and Jack could not make out any features. But as he watched, the figure slowly began to move towards him, its presence seeming to fill the entire street. Jack's heart was racing, and he felt a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He tried to take a step back, but his feet seemed rooted to the spot. Panic began to set in as Jack realized he was stranded. He tried to call for help, but his phone still had no signal. As he stood there, he started to feel a creeping sense of dread. The whispering seemed to be getting louder, and the shadows around him appeared to be growing longer and darker. The eerie feeling seemed to be closing in around him. He could feel eyes watching him, and the whispering seemed to be growing more urgent. Suddenly, Jack stumbled and fell, his flashlight flying out of his hand. As he looked up, he saw a figure standing over him, its face twisted into a malevolent grin. Jack heard a whispering voice, "You shouldn't be here." And then everything went black. When Jack came to, he was lying on the ground, his head throbbing with pain. He sat up slowly, looking around to get his bearings. The figure was nowhere to be seen, but the town was still eerily quiet. Jack struggled to his feet, his mind racing with questions. What had happened to him? Who or what had knocked him out? And where was he exactly? He looked around, trying to get his bearings. The town seemed to be surrounded by a thick forest, with no signs of civilization in sight. Jack's truck was still parked in the center of town, but his phone had no signal. Panic began to set in as Jack realized the gravity of his situation. He was stranded in a ghost town with no way to communicate with the outside world. As he hurried back to his truck, Jack noticed something strange. The buildings around him seemed to be shifting. The windows seemed to be changing shape, and the doors seemed to be moving of their own accord. Jack's skin crawled as he realized that something was very wrong in this town. He quickly got back into his truck and started the engine, determined to get out of there as fast as he could. But as he put the truck in gear, he heard a strange noise. It sounded like whispering. The whispering seemed to be coming from all around him, and it was getting louder by the second. Jack's heart was racing as he looked around, trying to see who or what was making the noise. But there was no one in sight. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. The silence was oppressive, and Jack felt like he was holding his breath. And then a voice spoke out of the darkness. "You shouldn't be here," it said. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he looked around, trying to see who was speaking. But there was no one in sight. "Who are you?" Jack demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. There was no answer. Jack knew that he had to get out of there, fast. He put the truck in gear and hit the gas, speeding out of town as fast as he could. As he looked in the rearview mirror, he saw the town disappearing into the distance. But he could have sworn that he saw a figure standing in the center of town, watching him leave.